This is Module 2, Topic 9, Thinking Critically About Education. This is 9.3. This brief presentation will talk about putting it all together in terms of the unit overall. Returning to where we began, this unit set out to stimulate your thinking about key educational questions of why, what, and how we educate, with a particular focus on critical thinking and reflection. We hope that you've been able to consider these questions as an introduction to some of the foundations of the applied discipline of education, which is a very broad and complex discipline. The unit has examined the ways historical, political and practical understandings of education apply in the Australian context in order to challenge some preconceived notions that you may have had or still have of schooling and education. The unit content has established a framework for you to build your own perspectives of the nature and purpose of education. In Module 1, we looked particularly at the notion of studying education, so looking at that broad discipline of education. Now, there was a lot of ground to cover, and when you see it collected like this, you really have achieved an awful lot. Each of the topics had 3 key concepts that were illustrating and expanding that idea for you. I won't read through each of those there for you, but you can see, as I said, that you've covered an awful lot of ground, and so the complexity of the discipline of education has been well and truly highlighted in that first module. In the second module, we shifted focus from studying education to looking at what it means to be an educator in a particular context. We only had 4 topics in this module. We're looking particularly at the Australian context, and then some of those really important aspects around what it takes to be an educator in that context. And Graham took you through 2 extraordinary topics based on her research, and this last topic is sort of a capstone, if you like, thinking critically about, getting you to sort of pull all of that together in your critical reflection and thinking about education. So the assessment tasks in this unit played a particular role in developing that framework we discussed in the aim. The aim of the quiz for you was for you to consolidate and check your understanding of key concepts presented within each of the topics. And again, if you haven't completed those quizzes, then it would be a really important element for you to do that. By working your way through the quiz topics, you have pulled together, as I said, an enormous amount of information, but also a language around which to speak of education, and an incremental understanding of the critical theoretical framework around which the unit has been constructed. The immersion experience was really to take you back to into teaching and learning, a context of teaching and learning, to apply that framework or that lens, that particularly that critical theory lens. By completing the report, you were able to provide evidence of your understanding of the nature and purpose of the practice you observe, but also of the conditions that shape the practice. Now, in terms of the framework that this unit has tried to apply, that lens of looking at practices and the conditions that shape them is a part of that critical framework, and it would be really important as you come to pull together all of your thinking about the unit that you are able to zoom in on some of the practices, some of the understandings that you've taken away from the unit, and then to zoom out of those again to look at some of the bigger picture things, the practice architectures, the traditions, so the higher order things around what's happening there. In other words, what I'm saying is don't describe the content, think about the content and how it all comes together and what's shaping your understandings of that, of those practices and of education in general, the nature and purpose of education. So the immersion task, I hope, took you to a place and a space in your mind that you may not have been to before, but also that you have revisited the construct or a particular context of education. The essay is, the purpose of this task is for you, it's your summative task to demonstrate your skills in critical thinking and writing. So you're required to reflect on the concepts and the topics presented in the unit, your wider reading, your lived experience, and your immersion experience to respond to this quote. To what extent does education mirror, and to what extent does it shape societies? It always does some of both. And that's taken from your text. This is a prompt for you to construct your own thinking about the unit. It is not a statement that you have to agree with. You might agree with it, you might want to change it, but as I've said in previous presentations, what you will need to do is to come up with your own thesis statement about that. Your thesis statement could be as simple as, education does mirror and shape society, full stop. And then you can go on and talk about how it does that. You might not agree that it does. This is a critical, reflective task, so it's not up to us to say what you can and can't say. I do want to spend a minute or a couple of minutes here just talking about how you might get to that point where you're reflecting on the topics and thinking critically about them. So I've just got one example. I've pulled one of the topics out, the history of education, and the three concepts that we talked about in that topic. One was the double history of education, education and schooling, and changing paradigms. So in relation to the double history of education, when I'm thinking about that and reflecting on my learning, and really briefly here in this presentation, there were things that really stood out for me. The role of the church, schooling as a definition and education as a definition, which were really quite different. The tensions that the authors brought up between the purpose of education and the purpose of schooling, and those concepts of them being anti-education, although they don't always line up. Also, that highlighted for me, going back to those intent and aims, that was an important learning for me. The shifts across time, that schools as institutions have been shaped and changed across time. They've really been quite different, but also some of the residual effects of those, the residual traditions of that history. I was also interested in the role the church has played in the evolution of history, of the history of schools of education across time, and the implications and traditions that may have set up. Mass education, the introduction of mass education was really a game changer, a paradigm shift, and it has had implications right through up into the present time. But also there were notions about access and power that were of real interest to me. There was a whole lot more, and I can't write it all down, but you might. Now, when I zoom out of that a little bit, take my lens away from the particularity of that content, it occurs to me that there was some mirroring evident in that history, that the social, economic and political structures of the times, of various times, were mirrored in those schools, in those institutions, those education settings. There were also, for me, this is evidence of that this topic or this concept about shaping what's possible and for whom. There's a really, particularly once mass education was introduced, was meant to be free, compulsory, and for everyone. Well, it wasn't for everyone, and there were still these issues around access and power, going right back to the Aristotelian traditions of who got an education and who didn't, and even until very recently in Australia, there were people who didn't have the same access to education, and therefore the power that it brings. So there's two examples of the mirroring and the shaping just from that little snippet there. Let's see what we might do with that then in terms of moving our reflection on. So just using that example again, the what is that capturing of the content, the description of your insights and understandings and observations. So at the what stage here, you're reacting and making sense of that topic. Looking at the so what, we went into that a little bit more. The so what was around what I've observed, and my opinion, about the mirroring and the shaping, but also the tensions between education and schooling. Also led me to think a little bit more deeply about the assumptions and beliefs about education, that it's, there was that old saying, education is freedom. That's Freire's assumption and belief that education is freedom. But does everybody get an education, and is everyone able to do that? What kinds of assumptions and beliefs does our experience or the contemporary experience of education, or across time, how has that been perpetuated or disrupted? So when we get to this so what stage, we're starting to form insights and understandings and shaping out those into arguments. So we're seeking deeper understanding by substantiating or refuting, and we're looking for evidence. So at this so what stage, I've probably got 4 arguments there. Maybe the last one's not as strong as I'd like it to be just yet, but I've got 3 arguments there around this notion of double history. 3 strong points I might like to investigate further and go look for evidence. Once I've done that, I can start thinking about the now what, the implications for children's family, myself as an educator, other educators, society. So in this particular example, again, I might be thinking about, again, that notion of access and power. And historically, over that double history, how has something like Australia's policy of closing the gap come to be? What's happened over time that we do have a gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians? So I'm starting to come to draw some conclusions, if you like, or reconstruct possibilities for practices and the conditions shaping them. I'm thinking about what if things were different, or how might I make it different? How might a change in policy or a change in some particular practices as we know them took place? Would that increase access? Would there be more shifts that would make a difference? So I'm doing what Sean would say is reframing the problem, if you like, or the topic in a way that I believe might make a difference in the future for myself as an educator, for the children that I teach, and for the society we live in. So in that case, chemists would say we're thinking about the points being more educational, in that they were aimed at living well in a world worth living in. So how do we assess your achievement in the unit? So you've pulled all this together, and it's up to us then. We've already started this assessment process, and we're asking you to think critically and write critically about your learning in the unit. So you've seen this Bloom's image. This is just a taxonomy of verbs, but it's the image and the descriptors, I suppose, that are most important there. I've talked to you about this before in terms of the kinds of grades that they equate to, but I think it's also interesting for you to see how that relates to this notion of critical thinking. Same way, really. The what is, if you describe, stay at that capturing the evidence and the insights, descriptive level of comprehension and knowledge, you're at the what level. Once you start applying that, that understanding and information and doing some analysis, you're moving into some analysis of the evidence and the readings, you're moving into the so what stage. You don't get to the now what stage until you start making some judgments, pulling ideas together, reframing the understandings and what it is that you've learnt in a way that makes sense to you and for some sort of evaluation of what you're doing. I didn't realise that. Oh, I now know, or it's some sort of revelation that you are reframing the way some of your assumptions and beliefs, or that you've come to new assumptions and understandings and beliefs about the nature and purpose of education. So that brings us to the end of this module and to the end of the unit. I wish you all the very best for your future studies here at SCU and for your life and work as a critically reflective practitioner. You will always be gazing at that little piece. And as one of the teachers in the presentation in this topic, Kayleen says to you, shares her insights into reflective practice, and she says, sometimes I wish I couldn't do it. I do too much of it, and it's quite disturbing. It is disturbing at times, but it's also incredibly rewarding. So, as a critically reflective practitioner, you will be disrupting your own practice, and at times that takes effort, but the effort is always worth it. All the best, everyone, and thanks for your engagement in this unit.